And welcome to week 6 of our general ethics course. Today we get to discuss uh, the role of nature, really, for the first time, and it's based in some Eastern philosophy, that of Mencius, Sun-Tzu, and Xuang-Tzu, and there are three different works. I, the human nature, one claiming human nature is good, the other claiming human nature is evil, and the third really trying to proclaim the way, the Tao, and Tao is the word, the Chinese word for way. And these three philosophers, if you will, are not, I mean, they're all Confucianists in some way. Taoism is not the same as Confucianism. And as you can see in Xuangzi, he takes a lot of Confucius characterizations and has them kind of come to deep realization of the Tao. So it's clear he likes Confucius, but thinks it's kind of a beginning to the Tao or something like that. This is what we'll see. Whereas Mencius and Sun-Tzu are much more strictly Confucian, but with a different take on how human nature is situated, such that benevolence and righteousness are the two characteristics proper to life. Okay. I characterized the title as "What Role Does Nature Play?" to repeat myself, because that's really what the way is and what Mencius and Sun-Tzu are concerned with, for that matter. So, even though all these authors, well, I know in some direct and some implicit ways disagree with each other, they would all agree that it's fundamental to morality that you try to understand the natural order. I'm going to try to explain that throughout each author's thought. You're going to want to have the book with you on hand as usual. I like to reference a page number and read from that to a certain extent and kind of sum it up in this PowerPoint, so keep the book with you. So, as I put it as a kind of preliminary, we're traveling east. The Western way of looking at reality has to be, to an extent, left behind. Now, that is not to say forgotten. What I mean is, it is intriguing how differently some basic mental processes are done, if you will. Whereas here in the West, thanks to the Greeks, as I put it, like, we focus on this passionate desire to understand the truth. I would say that's what characterizes the West. It's why it's in the West that you have the birth of the scientific method. It's why it's in the West that you have Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. It's why in the West you have Thomas Aquinas and plenty of people in between. Plotinus and the Neoplatonists. Everything is focused in all these authors on how do we come to know, right? How do we come to some kind of certainty? And we want to focus everything on there first and foremost. That's not so much a concern in the East, not because they don't want to be wise, if you will, but because they want to take what is for granted, and move on to the next step. So there's often more of a morality structure to the East, like a focus on how one ought to live one's life. Everybody's interested in that, of course, but in the East, it's one of the beginning things, because it's like, well, you can kind of take nature for granted. You know what nature is. Why do you need to explain it too much? And there's a limitation to this approach, right? Don't get me wrong. There's a problem there. It's when you need to be able to articulate something to say you fully understand it. So to say you know what nature is not really sufficient. You have to. It's a good place to start, and it's so important not to deny that you do, as a matter of fact, know what nature is. You know that what it is to be a human being, right? You know that, even if you have a hard time putting it into words. It's important to remember that, but also to not think that putting it into words is insignificant. So, what I like about the East is that they know that you know what it is to be a human being. What I like about the West is that desire to be able to put it into words. And each part has its excellence, each part has its weakness, because what happens in the West sometimes is, in the attempt to put it into words and the difficulty there, people actually start to deny things that they really know. I mean, here's a great example. You know that motion is real, and you know what it is. There are people who, in their attempt to explain motion, essentially explain it as really being just like a a set of states, not even. They kind of really deny the reality of motion. It's like, well, all that motion is this like this order of states. That's to actually deny that it's really a mode of being, if you will. Um, and that's where you see the problem with the West, is that in the attempt to put things into words, we can say crazy things. So I like the East because it's common sense. I like the West because it realizes that you should build on your common sense. And there's strengths to each side. It's best to remember both things, really. Okay, so with that exactly in mind, right, you should be asking yourself, what do I mean by the word nature? Right? Sometimes we mean something like Mother Nature, like everything, the natural order, all that. Sometimes we mean uh, the way things are, right? That structure to your experience. Maybe it's, why do trees follow a certain order in their activity? Well, you say, well, that's their nature, right? It's the way things are. They do it because it's the sort of thing they are. So we're going to have an example in this from Sun Tzu, who will talk, or not Sun Tzu, Mencius, who will talk about the barley. Right? You grow a field of barley, and any farmer will tell you, right, you want to have the right conditions, right? The nature of barley is to grow in a certain way. You want to encourage that and nurture it. But the nature of barley is to grow in a certain way, and it'll do that if you give it its nature, its own chance, right? So nature is kind of that principle of activity. It's that principle of the thing and what it does. And that's really more of what's concerned here. Right? We can speak about nature as like Mother Nature or the natural world around us. But we're most of all interested in nature insofar as you're talking about the way a thing is, the way it operates, how it acts, everything that goes into that. So when you talk about human nature, you're looking at what a human being is and how he acts and what is the order of his existence, if you will. So now Mencius's position is to hold that nature, human nature, is good. And he gives us some arguments. He first says that it's constituted to want the good. Look at page 64 with me to see that. This is, let's see, chapter 6, line 5. Mencius said, "From the feelings proper to it, the human nature, is constituted for the practice of what is good." This is what I mean in saying that the nature is good. And then he goes on to talk about particular instances, right? The feeling of commiseration or sympathy belongs with men as with shame and dislike. Reverence and respect, approving and disapproving. Feeling of commiseration applies the principle of benevolence. That of shame and dislike, the principle of righteousness, right? You're righteous. You're ashamed of not being righteous. When you do something that's not righteous or right, you're ashamed. And when you commiserate with somebody, it's because there's a kind of looking to their good, a willing the good for them. That's what benevolence means, to will the good. Just like righteousness means to kind of hold fast to it. So, what he's saying, right, is when you look at a thing and its natural inclinations, you see that the activities it wants are its good. It wants to be good. And he's saying, in the human nature in particular, you can see benevolence and righteousness, those two things, willing the good for all and trying to hold fast to what is right. That's the kind of Chinese Confucian principle. He also says, well, it's like water. It has a direction. This is page 61, 62. It's the first two things he really does in chapter 2. Man's nature is like water. This is page 61, bottom of it. Man's nature is like water whirling around in a corner. Open a passage for it to the east, it will flow to the east. Open a passage to the west, it will flow to the west. Man's nature is indifferent to good and evil, just as the water is indifferent to the east and the west. That's what the philosopher Cao said. Mencius replied, "Water indeed will flow indifferently to the east and the west, but will it flow indifferently up or down? The tendency of man's nature to good is like the tendency of water to flow downwards. There are none but have this tendency to good, just as water flows downwards. Now by striking water and causing it to leap up, you may make it go over your forehead, and by damming it and leading it, you may force it up a hill. But such are movements according to the nature. But are such movements according to the nature of water? It is the force applied which causes them. When men are made to do what is not good, their nature is dealt with in this way. His point is, especially taking along with that first thing, right? He says, look to your nature. It has these inclinations to certain perfections, and those are good, and you can block them. You can try to lead yourself in a different direction. That's bad. But just follow those natural inclinations. That's still a very vague statement, but it's his claim so far. And he says, look, all of nature, we say this is true about everything else. Why don't we say it's true about man's nature as well? So he gives you example of barley. Look to page 65. This is the second line of page 65. The second line, of chapter 7, so it's the one with the little 2 in parentheses. There now is barley. Let it be sown and covered up. The ground being the same, and the time of sowing likewise the same, it grows rapidly up, and when the full time is come, it is found to be ripe. Although there may be inequalities of produce, that is owing to the difference of the soil, as rich or poor, or to the unequal nourishment afforded by the rains and the dews, or to the different ways in which man has performed his business in reference to it. Thus all things which are the same in kind are like to one another. Why should we doubt in regard to man that if he were as if he were a solitary exception to this? The sage and we are the same in kind. So the point is, right, you look at something in its nature, and its nature is to be a certain way, and says that's true with man too. Why would you disagree? Why would you argue against that? You'd say, look, your nature, your inclination is ordered to certain perfections. That's you nurture that, you encourage that, just like you would the barley, and you'll come to the good. Why would man be different than everything else? So there's a kind of argument from analogy. It's what I was saying with the distinction between the East and the West, right? He's kind of satisfied with that way to go about it. He has this kind of intuition based upon an analogy with all of nature. And that to him is proof of his point. Now you could say that seems a little bit shoddy. This is where I would say to you again, right, think for a second about what you already know implicitly. This is the strength of the Eastern philosophers, at least these Chinese Eastern philosophers in particular. Don't forget what you already know, right? There's something true in this, right? You're inclined to perfections, and a lot of what you do to yourself that you might end up saying bad is because you're actually violating something that was natural to you. I mean, think about the temperance and intemperance is the easiest example I can give you, right? It's pretty clear that you want to be healthy. There might be things you want more than health, but you want to be healthy. And, if you eat too much or drink too much, and you get overweight, it doesn't help your mood, it doesn't help you feel good. You can see it's not good for you, and you say, I've violated some natural order here. Right? By giving in to certain appetites that I have, I've given up this more basic point. It's like, I want to be healthy. And he wants to say that's the same thing here, right? You might go too far with a desire or a passion and see that you've actually violated the inclination of your very being. That's the insight he has here, right? You want to nurture that basic aspect of what it is to be human, and that's what is going to be the good life. So as he puts it on page 66, Confucius said, this is the bottom of page 66, hold fast and it remains with you. Let it go and you lose it. Its outgoing and incoming cannot be defined as to time or place. It is the mind of which this is said. Okay, now I think I must have marked that down not so perfectly. But as a matter of fact, it is what he wants to say. Look at the top of the page as well, page 66. The principles of our nature and the determinations of righteousness are agreeable to my mind, just as the flesh of grass and grain-fed animals is agreeable to my mouth. In other words, and this is, by the way, in conjunction with a somewhat dubious claim that we all have the same appetites, but it's in conjunction with that fast. The nature, you want to hold fast to what is natural to you because that will bring you to righteousness and benevolence. which are the principles of a good life. Okay. So, live your life so as to hold fast to what is your natural order. That is Mencius. And as I said, his argument is all based on analogy and upon the common sense realization that you want some kind of perfection of your own being, and that's good. Even if that doesn't like give you a demonstration of what he's saying, don't let the compelling aspect that's rooted in a common sense realization leave you unmoved. At the same time, let's turn to Sun Tzu, who wants to say human nature is evil. This is fascinating to me, because I want to say, on the face of it, they sound dramatically different from each other, right? On the face of it, they sound totally opposed, and yet, it's going to end up sounding almost identical, I would argue. But his way of going about it is to also notice things that you should recognize as being common sense as well, and common sense in a way that at least appears opposed to what Mencius was already saying. So, for Sun Tzu, right, I want you to start on page 70, right? The very first lines of his treatise. Man's nature is evil. Goodness is a result of conscious activity. The nature of man is such that he is born with a fondness for profit. If he indulges this fondness, it will lead him to wrangling and strife. In other words, he has to correct himself. Man is born with the desires of the eyes and ears, and with a fondness for beautiful sights and sounds. If he indulges these, they will lead him into license and wantonness, and all ritual principles and correct forms will be lost. In other words, let's say by rituals and correct forms, traditions, laws, we keep these desires for profit and gain in check. So as he puts it about halfway, or the very last two sentences of the first paragraph in his treatise, on page 70, therefore man must first be transformed by the instructions of a teacher and guided by ritual principles, and you could think to yourself of traditions, customs, and laws, and only then will he be able to observe the dictates of courtesy and humility, obey the forms of rules in society, and achieve order. Think to yourself of how, if you have children, think of how you're trying to help them look to the common good, look to the good of those around them, not just be focused on themselves. Think about that fact when you say, when you to try to make sense of precisely what he's talking about here, right? Not only is it clear that people are still often inclined to be greedy and to want profit, and you can look in your own life, I'm sure, and I'm not accusing any of you in particular. I can look in my life and see instances where I've really had to fight with selfishness, right? And I still do constantly, in ways that I probably don't even realize, right? We have those inclinations to take advantage. And he says, look at those and recognize that those are in you. Recognize that they have to be trained out of you. And that's the where you want to say maybe human nature is evil, because that's the stuff that you have in you without any training. And it's often the work of training and law and custom and upbringing to help you work against that. That's Sun Tzu in a nutshell, by the way. So he says on page 71, that you want to, get away from this naivete, this state of wanting profit and gain, right, is the view you're trying to purge yourself of and to correct with ritual and practice and law and upbringing, etc. Look to the second to last paragraph, the last full paragraph on the page. Look at the last couple sentences. It is the way with man's nature that as soon as he is born, he begins to depart from his original naivete and simplicity, and therefore he must inevitably lose what Mencius regards as his original nature. It is thus obvious, then, that the nature of man is evil. In other words, and think here that maybe the word evil is not being used quite in the same way as you might think of it, the way that we tend to now, right? Think of the fact he wants to say that the things in you that are untrained are all things you try to kind of get rid of, if you will. You're trying to train yourself out of that natural state, right? Think of all the steps that come from, that go through upbringing. if you have children, it's really helpful to see. I mean, you love them and you want the good for them, and you don't want them to remain helpless in the way that they are for all their life. I mean, you delight in helping them. I mean, parents love their children, love to help their children. But what you're helping them do is get out of a state that, even if it's very cute and adorable, right? Part of the adorable and cuteness of it is that they are developing and becoming something greater and greater constantly, right? There's this development from your natural condition that seems eminently desirable. There's something that's undesirable, and thus, in that sense, evil, um, in remaining without the power to act rationally and with completion. Um, the way he puts it on page 73 is particularly helpful. First full paragraph there, looking at the beginning of it. Every man who desires to do good does so precisely because his nature is evil. A man whose accomplishments are meager longs for greatness. An ugly man longs for beauty. A man in cramped quarters longs for spaciousness. A poor man longs for wealth. A humble man longs for eminence. Whatever a man lacks in himself, he will seek outside. In other words, right, if you really were born good, there's a sense in which you wouldn't do anything. It's precisely insofar as you see an imperfection that you are moved to act. That's Sun Tzu's realization, and it's kind of a restatement of what we said before, but maybe that's the best way of putting it, right? You're born in a state of incompleteness, and it's precisely that recognition of being imperfect that drives us to act, or you might say moves us to act. Okay. And then he also, points out again, why would we need teachers and trainers and sages and traditions and laws and customs, and look to page 74, if we were good? If we were good, surely we could dispense with sage kings and forget about ritual principles and traditions and customs and laws, etc. So, the point here is exactly what we said, right? If you want the human nature is good, you seem to be saying something like you have no reason to act. It's precisely because your nature is lacking that you're moved to action. It's precisely because your nature is a state, you're born in a state of undesirable existence that you move to try to correct it. And I think that's true even down the line. Even if you have a pretty pleasant life, you never have perfect happiness. You never have perfect completion. Or if you do, or if there are such people, it's few and far between. There's always things that can be improved, always things that you want to make better. There's always troubles that beset us in our lives. So what's the point of life for Sun Tzu? It's to counterbalance this evil, or better yet, I should have put this, to bring oneself out of an empty situation, right? It's to improve or perfect what is lacking in the state of nature. Okay. Now, I hope we're already seeing, and I sum this up later, that Mencius and Sun Tzu might be talking past each other. Mencius focusing on the fact that there seems to be in nature certain perfections that pertain to you according to what you are. And those perfections are to be pursued and nurtured and not blocked. With Sun Tzu, he's noting that just the simple fact of your state, the state of your existence, is imperfect. But that's not really to disagree with Mencius. That's to actually make his same point, but maybe more poignantly even, right? You're born, it depends on how you want to think about good and evil, really, right? You can look at your potentials. You can look at the goals of your existence and see them as good. And that's what Mencius is doing. Or you could look at the state where you're born, where you don't have those things, and you want them. And then you'd say the state of your nature is kind of evil and needs to be brought into completion. And you have to realize this is what gives the most force to Sun Tzu. It's also clear that we have impulses that are not trained impulses to selfishness. And that's true about almost everybody. Maybe not everybody. If so, wow, that's quite a gift. You'd have to start speaking about being blessed in that case, right? Because, brother, people want to take advantage of each other, and even good people, often what distinguishes a good person from a so-called bad person is going to be whether or not they listen to that impulse, right? or counterbalance that impulse. And that's the other side of Sun Tzu. So it seems to me he's kind of mixing together two things here. One, there are a lot of nasty impulses we have, but two, we're born in a state of imperfection. And that part is just kind of actually in agreement with Mencius. The other one is a real problem. How do you deal with the fact that we have inclinations to do nasty things? That's hard to deal with. Okay, come back to that later. To look at Shuangzi, he wants to shift the focus away from the human nature to nature more broadly. So what you can see from him are, I kind of give you 4 bullet points. He's not focused on traditional categories of virtue. He condemns the practices that violate the innate nature and says the Tao, the way, is a community of life, and says that the way, the Tao, is not something that can be taught. All of these points I do think are important, and some are more true than others. But the first one that's really interesting is he wants to move you away from trying to find benevolence and righteousness. Not to deny it's good, but to see that, don't see that as the way. And this is something we could spend all class on. I'm just going to make a few notes. Look to page 86 for a second. Confucius said, and this is page 86 towards the top, you can see the paragraph or the back and forth, wherein Confucius say, in essence, Confucius said, in essence, it is benevolence and righteousness. That's the way. And Lao Tzu said, may I ask, are benevolence and righteousness the very essence of humanity? Certainly, said Confucius. If the nobleman is without benevolence, he has no purpose. If without righteousness, he has no life. Benevolence and righteousness, these are truly of the innate nature of humanity. How else could it be? That's a very Mencian statement right there. May I ask, said Lao Tzu, what are benevolence and righteousness? To be at one, centered in one's heart, in love with all, without selfishness. This is what benevolence and righteousness are, replied Confucius. It's a beautiful answer, right? Really, your words reveal misunderstanding, said Lao Tzu. Love of all, that is really both vague and exaggeration, without selfishness. Isn't that rather selfish? Sir, if you want people to remain simple, shouldn't you look to the ways of heaven and earth? That's such a confusing back and forth, right? But you can, first of all, you can see it's to move away from the notions of benevolence and righteousness as they are practiced. However, I want you to see that this doesn't mean he thinks you should deny righteousness and benevolence. Look at page 87 for a second here, towards the bottom of that poem. He gets to the heart of issues, and note this is the person who lives the way, right? Who knows how to protect the foundation of truth as heaven and earth are outside of him. He ignores all life, and his spirit is never wearied. He travels with the Tao, is in agreement with with virtue, bids farewell to benevolence and righteousness, and ignores ritual and music, because the perfect man has set his heart upon what is right. So in other words, benevolence and righteousness are not to be seen as shunned exactly so much as to be moved beyond. Let's look also at page 90 here. The last 4 lines of the poem on that page. Benevolence and righteousness are as the houses of former kings, useful for one night's shelter, but don't stay there too long. In other words, you have to move on from it. Okay, how to understand this? What is he saying? How can being unselfish be selfish? If your notions of selfishness are such that you're really focusing simply on your internal existence, right? Then you're being selfish, right? So the person who says something like, I think this is even beyond, it's more selfish than what Confucius in this story was saying, but it's a good step to maybe understand what Lao Tzu is saying. If you do unselfish things for the sake of feeling good, you're actually being selfish, even though your desire is to be unselfish. Because your desire is to be unselfish so that you can feel good. In other words, it comes back to you. Okay, if you can think about that for a second and realize I'm not saying that that's wicked, by the way, right? It's good to feel good about doing good things. But what you want to make sure is that you're doing the good things for their own sake. And then then rejoice in it making you feel good, right? It's kind of like the feeling good is something to rejoice in, but it's not the reason you do what you do. Okay. When you realize then that could be a reason you could be selfish when you're doing things that are in themselves good, you have a sense what Lao Tzu is trying to warn him against, right? If your view of life is locking you out, locking you into your own mind, you're not living without selfishness, even if the principles that are trying to guide you are to be without selfishness. So he wants to say, like, look, it might be a start to try to kind of categorize your actions in a certain way, but probably perfection is going to be by like internalizing that such that you're no longer really naming it. It's become part of just how you are and who you are and how you act, and it's not really something you're focusing on and trying to live out in your mind. It's just how you live out in your experience with the world. Now that's a pretty vague statement, but I hope it rings true and gets to the beginning of what Shuangzi is trying to get us to see, that living the moral life is going to be about internalizing things, not about stepping outside of your action and reflecting upon it. It's going to be living the truth, right? That's what's exciting about the moral life, and what separates it from the life from contemplation. I mean, they're not opposed, but that the moral life has to do with living the truth, whereas contemplation has to do with thinking about the truth as such. And that's kind of what Shuangzi is trying to get us to start to see. So, along with Mencius, and maybe what Sun Tzu even is thinking, he then really radically condemns practices that violate the innate nature. And you can think about this example with Po Lo, the horse trainer, from the very beginning of this reading, page 79. And you can read through that whole thing. I would suggest that you do. In fact, you could even pause this. I want to get on because I don't want you guys to have too long a recording to listen to, as it were. But if you read this account of Po Lo, the horse trainer, right, he wants to say, what you do when you train horses is you break them. You break them of their innate nature, so that they can serve you. And by the way, I'm not even sure if he thinks that's a bad thing. But insofar as you understand that he's breaking the innate nature, you've got a problem if you're speaking about, like, that's how you're living your life. You're kind of trying to break yourself of your innate nature and make it serve something else. That would be the problem, right? So it's one thing whether or not you're supposed to be breaking animals, or that's what we call that act of kind of taming a horse. It's breaking it. There is a kind of brokenness to it, and maybe that's not a problem, but it's something that Shuangzi is saying you have to make sure you're not doing that to yourself in your activity. That's the point of that example with Po Lo, the horse trainer. And on page 86, you can see another account that going along with the what we previously quoted from Confucius saying, right? The essence of humanity is righteousness and benevolence, right? He says no, the essence of humanity, or the essence of action, has to be the Tao. It's the way, because that's what's going to fulfill the innate nature, and that's what leads into this third bullet point, right? Like, okay, what's distinct from that? It's that whole internalizing the truth such that you're living it and not necessarily contemplating it, which is kind of what happens when you're Confucius. And that, he says, is by focusing on finding your place in the community of beings. And I'm going to try to sum this up by looking at a quote on page 82. There is a saying, so I go after the poem. The poem is helpful, but go with the poem, after the poem. If you know the happiness of heaven, then you know that life is from heaven, and death is the transformation of things. In their stillness they are yin, and in their journeying they are yang. Okay, so it's the yin-yang stuff, right? To know heavenly happiness means that you do not upset heaven, nor go against others. You are not reliant on material things. You are not rebuked by the ghosts or the spirits. There is a saying, he moves with heaven and rests with earth. His heart is one, and he is king of the whole world. The spirits do not worry him, and his soul is not wearied. His heart is one with all living things. Okay. Now, if you've heard yin-yang teachings before, and if you understand the Taoism, you might have a sense of what he's saying, but at the same time, you might lead you astray. What he wants to help you see, right, is this: if you're trying to fulfill your innate nature, it's going to happen by living in nature and with nature and in conjunction with it. And I don't mean that, by the way, I don't think that means, like environmentalism as it's understood today. I'm not making any comments on that one way or the other. I don't think he means joining Greenpeace or doing something like that, whether that's a good thing to do or not. I think he really means, right, you have to find your place in the life that really is present in the world. Okay, how do I put that right? Think about all the concrete circumstances that go into your life. You're born to a certain place, you're born to a certain time, you're born to certain parents, you're born to a certain family, you're born into a certain nation, you're born into a certain country, you're born into a certain city, you're born into a certain province, you're born with a certain intelligence, you're born with certain aptitudes, you're born with all these specific characteristics. He says the Tao is going to depend upon living there, right? So your Tao and my Tao might not be the same except generically. And I think that's a very important point. You have to live in the life you are. And that's to look into all the circumstances and to recognize you are playing a part. You are not the whole, right? So when does benevolence and righteousness become selfishness? When you're actually focusing in on yourself so much that what you're doing is for the sake of kind of categorizing it. So and I don't know why, there should be one more quote here, but look to the very last words of his treatise, and that's on page 92, 91 and 92. Confucius finally gets it here. I've grasped it. The very last lines here. I'm looking at even the first sentence of the last paragraph on that page. The raven hatches its young. The fish spew forth their eggs. The slim-waisted wasp transforms. And when a younger brother comes along, the elder brother weeps. For too long I have not been able to work in harmony with these changes. So given that I did not play my part in harmony with others, how could I expect to change people? Well done, Lao Tzu replied. Now you've grasped it. Harmony in the concrete realities that you find yourself. Not trying too hard to abstract and categorize and put things and instances into boxes. Now, he might go overboard with this. I'm not trying to claim he doesn't. But there's something really true here. You have to live the truth, not just think about it. Sometimes we say like it's easy, you have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. There's something of that here too, right? You have to concretize your understanding such that it is, really you're living it. Okay, one more example that really makes that point. Page 87, 88 is one of my favorite passages to read in all of probably my favorite passage of all these three authors. He has this whole poem. Starts on 87, and then on 88 he has this account of Duke Huan sitting in the hall reading a book. So there's a noble sitting and reading, and a wheelwright, Pian, comes down into the courtyard, and he's down there making a wheel. He puts down his chisel and hammer, and he starts talking to the Duke, and he says, "What are you reading?" The Duke replies, "The words of the sages. Are these sages still living? They are long dead. Then, sir, what you are reading is nothing but rubbish left over from these ancient men." Immediately you should say to yourself, wait, well, what are we doing but exactly that? What is he saying to us? And then the guy says, "How dare you, a wheelwright, comment on what I read? If you explain this, fine. If not, you shall die." The wheelwright replied, "Your lordship's servant looks at it from the perspective of his own work. When I work on a wheel, if I hit too softly, pleasant as that might be, it doesn't make for a good wheel. If I hit too hard, I ruin the wheel. Right? I have to hit it just right, not too soft, not too vigorously. I can't express what that right amount is." I'm paraphrasing here. "But I do know it. I cannot teach it, nor can my son learn it from me," right? I can't teach it to him, nor can he learn it. I just know it. What is he saying to us? He's saying, again, you have to live the truth. And that means to concretize it. That means to find that right amount. So much of life comes down to not doing too much or doing too little. Maybe not everything in life, right? I'm going to end up arguing that there's an aspect of experience, namely contemplation, that is not addressed adequately here. But this is the beginning of the moral life, is this realization, right, that often doing the right thing is going to come down to a matter of a kind of feeling, not feeling like, what does your heart tell you, sort of feeling the way I find that really annoying from a philosopher's perspective when people answer a question like, what does your heart tell you? This might be what they're trying to get at, but it's often kind of done in a very superficial way. But if you think about any moral decision you've had to make and that you've struggled with, and if it's an ongoing situation, how you've had to struggle to find out what is just right. And I can give you an easy example. Temperance is almost always the easiest example, right? What is eating the right amount? And it's never going to be as simple as, well, I need to eat. It's never going to be as easy, to answer that. I mean, it's easy to say I need to not eat too much or not eat too little, but what is the right amount, and what is the right stuff to eat, right? And what amount of exercise can I manage, and what kind of exercise can I manage in my life and still, fulfill my other duties, right? If your duty, like mine, for instance, consists in trying to prepare for these lectures and prepare for other lectures and do a lot of reading, I do a lot of sitting around, and I need to do exercise to counterbalance that, but I also have to balance, the need for exercise with the need to get done certain other duties that I have. And, what kind of food should I be eating to keep up the lifestyle that I need to live, right? Not just what I want, but what I need to live in order to fulfill all my obligations. The question for temperance, right, is going to vary from person to person based on what they need to do. But they still always have to find out what is just right. And that's where this insight is profound, right? You have to realize that many moral situations are going to come down to a matter of feeling. You can say, I need to not do too much or not do too little, but finding what is just right is a matter of experience, working hard, and gaining a proper sense. Okay, so his conclusion, what's the point of life? Hold fast to the Tao. What does this mean? It's to try to internalize, right? Internalize your place in the cosmos and live it. Internalize how you're supposed to, what is just right for you in your particular concrete area. You have to attune yourself to the whole cosmos and your place in it, and that, insofar as you actually do that, internalize it, right? You're living the truth. You're not just thinking about it or trying to figure out how to categorize it. And that seems to me the moral life, right? And that's where the Shuangzi, right, where Confucius says, I finally get it. He gives you really concrete examples, and he says, I finally see what you're saying, right? I have to play my part in in the whole I find myself in. That's the Tao. What I want us to take out of this is three things. One, this notion, the realization that even if it's hard to put into words what nature is, the importance of it for living an ethical life, a moral life. That's realization we need to hold on to. I think it's also important to realize that the good and bad impulses are part of what it is to be human. And you could have different reasons for saying, right? Maybe we're naturally good, but we also have to perfect ourselves. And these inclinations to evil, are they part of our nature? Or are they something added on that seems to be dragging our nature down in some way? How to think about that is a huge question. It's actually a theological question. Hard to know how you think about it, really, philosophically. I think philosophically it doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense. It's just something you have to deal with. We have a certain nature with certain inclinations in order to them. but we're also dragged by these perverse inclinations that take us away from the natural goods. But both of those impulses are there. These impulses to good, these impulses to evil. We need to be able to account for that in our notion, in our understanding of the moral life. We need to be recognize both sides of that situation. And I think really attend to what Sun Tzu puts so beautifully, right? We're born in a kind of poverty, and I don't just mean wealth, but we're born lacking things, and we try to perfect and build and grow and get out of what we lack and into a kind of perfection. That's fundamental to being human. That seems to be the second thing we really want to take out of this. And third, what we finished with Shuangzi, right? What is just right? What is just right? It's easy to say, I need to not do too much or not do too little in all sorts of situations, whether it be temperance, whether it be courage, right? You can be reckless, you can be losing my mind here. One might be reckless, one might be cowardly, or one might be courageous. There seems to be a kind of if you have too much fear, you're a coward. If you have no fear at all, you're probably reckless. If you're courageous, it's that you have a kind of right amount of fear. True about temperance, right? Somehow not desiring too much, not desiring too little, desiring just the right amount. Having a sense of being prudent with regards to what is the right word for this? I was thinking you don't want to call it truthfulness. It's because I think there's no limit to how truthful one should be, but discreet, right? Being discreet means often judging the situation which you're in and saying, when am I saying too much about a situation? When does it become gossip? When does it become too taciturn? When am I saying what's the right amount, right? Things like that. There's all sorts of kinds of situations we find ourselves in where we have to deal with finding just the right amount. And that realization will have to be helpful for us in our ethical study for finding how we ought to live our lives, as it were. Okay. Have an excellent week. I will be getting extra both the response. You can see the response paper prompt on eCollege, and there's going to be extra credit opportunities named this week. I didn't get around to it last week. I got too many things came up, but I'll do it. It'll be coming up in the next couple of days, and you'll have 2 weeks or so to complete the first possible extra credit assignment, and then there will be one more later in the semester. And if you're desperate, I will work with you for if you I'll work with you. I'll work with anybody. I want everybody to do well. I can give you a third extra credit option if you need it, if you want it. But there will be at least one more official one that you can do later on as well. Have an excellent week.